Hello, everyone. My name is Dafne. My mentor is Professor Nathan Nan, and today I will present my research on land reform and income redistribution, looking at the long-term effects of my country, Peru's 1970s land reform. So a little bit about the background. Land was a key component of the daily life of the economically active population in Peru at the time that the land reform took place, with about half the population working in agriculture in the mid-1960s. However, land reform also took place in the context of major inequality in land tenure, with 1% of the landowners owing 80% of all private land. Land reform was a result of a military coup. From 1969 to 1979, over 9 million hectares of land were expropriated. This represented about 39% of all agricultural land in the country. Land reform has been a common occurrence across the world and particularly in Latin America, with almost all countries in the region going through a process of land reform at some point in their post-colonial history. However, the long-term effects of land reform are still contested, so the question then becomes, in the long run, does land reform do on average more harm than good? Does land reform serve as a persistent equalizer, helping the poor even if it hurts the rich? And how do these effects vary over time? Now we'll talk a little bit about the specific natural experiment setting that the Peruvian land reform led itself to. In the 1970s, Peru was divided into 24 states, and these in turn were divided into under 1,600 districts. Land reform in Peru was implemented through agrarian reform zones, or ARZs, which were established in 1961 for trade and agricultural purposes. ARZs cross-cut state boundaries. As you can see, the ARZ borders that are shown in red in the map don't map directly onto the states, which are shown in green. Each ARZ had a headquarter, which, for reasons exogenous to the land reform, happened to be located in one state, but not the other states within the ARZ. So this creates a natural experiment setting. The districts in states where a headquarter was located had land reform implemented with more intensity. So I will refer to these districts as core districts. Core districts are shaded pink in the map. So this manner in which land reform policy was implemented, as I mentioned, created this natural experiment that I can then exploit. The empirical analysis uses an OLS fixed effects estimator to compare core and peripheral districts within the same state. Beyond this, I also use an RD strategy to obtain an even more convincing Tassel estimate. Finally, I use quantile regressions to obtain estimates on the effect on different income groups. Here is the OLS fixed effect specification, where the dependent variable is log income and X is a binary that takes a value of 1 if a district D is a core district, 0 otherwise. My main unit of analysis is at the household level, I. Alpha, on the other hand, denotes state S fixed effects, and W prime is a vector of covariates that I include as controls. I also estimate an RD version of this at the district level and a quantile regression, which estimates distributional effects. So using OLS and RD, I find that the land reform increased the average household income of the population in the early 21st century. Using quantile regressions, I find that land reform decreases the household income of the richest 5%, but increased the income of the poorest 75%. Further, between 2002 and 2016, the magnitude of the negative effects for the richest attenuated over time, whereas the positive effects for the poorest persisted in the long run. I first examined the average effects of land reform. This first table shows the OLS and the RD estimate with different outcome variables measured in 2016. We can see that land reform had a positive and significant effect on average income and public good coverage, and a negative and significant effect on poverty. I now turn to the distributional consequences of land reform. This slide shows the quantile regression results. As you can see, the poorest 75% of the population was helped by the land reform, while the richest 5% were hurt. Finally, I examine how the distributional effects change over time. This graph plots the coefficients for the same quantile regression, but for 4 different years. As you can see, the magnitude of the negative effects declines over time. On the other hand, there is no similar systematic change for the positive effects. So that's the end of my presentation. For my next steps, I want to examine the consequences of land reform for expropriated families and their descendants. And second, I want to test the political effects of land reform, looking at dependent variables such as voting patterns, participation, and ethnic representation. Last, I want to study the long-term consequences of land expropriation during the colonial period and its connection to the 1970s land reform. So thank you so much for your attention, and thank you to Research in Color for the opportunity to pursue this research, and of course to Professor Nathan Nan for mentoring me throughout this process.